All right. How's everybody doing today? We're going to actually be starting here on taking a look at something called passive transport. We've talked about the fact that the cell membrane uh, is involved in this idea of allowing particles and things to go in or out of a cell, or can stop things from going in or out of a cell. And so we can place that idea of moving particles into a topic called cell transport, where things are transported in or out of the cell. And we can break that down into two categories, either passive transport or active transport. And we're going to spend a majority of our time talking about passive transport as it happens. We'll check in a little bit with active transport as well. In a few days, but right now we're taking a look at passive transport. So the idea being that whenever you have a drop of food coloring, you drop it into water. Um, that that color doesn't stay concentrated in just one spot. It actually diffuses, is the vocabulary word that we're going to look at. It diffuses throughout the water until it becomes evenly distributed. It happens naturally. Yes, you can stir it to help it happen a little faster, but it's going to happen even without your help. And so this idea of passive transport kind of builds on that, where things are moving in and out of a cell naturally without there having to be any effort. So with passive transport, the cell is not using any energy. It's not using any ATP. Remember, that stands for adenosine triphosphate. Doesn't need any energy to move molecules in or out of the cell when passive transport is happening. There's no work taking place. There's no effort on the part of the cell. It just happens because that is the order that God has set up in the world. Now, take a look at our kayaker here. Take a look at the river or stream that this kayaker is on. Is this kayaker going to need to spend his own energy paddling in order to move? No, he's not, because he's moving with the flow of the river. And so with passive transport, there's a natural flow to how things move. And that natural flow is that molecules or particles move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. We say that they move down their concentration gradient. So here we have a whole lot of yellow molecules, all right, in a large blue box. Right now they're very concentrated down the bottom left-hand corner, but over time they are naturally going to start to diffuse or spread out. Same thing happens even just with human beings. If you walk into a super crowded room, the natural tendency is that some people are going to want to move out of that room into places that don't have as many people. So when we started here, the particles were very concentrated in one little spot. We call that an area of high concentration. Over here, where there are none of those molecules, this would be an area of low concentration for yellow molecules. And then over time, they spread out. Um, some examples of different kinds of passive transport where things move from high to low concentration, no energy has to be spent. One example would be diffusion. All right, and so in diffusion is a type of passive transport, and it's kind of a category of passive transport. So osmosis is really a special type of diffusion, only it's a special type that where we're talking about the movement of water, H2O. Okay, so if we talk about osmosis, we always know that the thing that is moving is water from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Previously, when we were looking at these yellow molecules here, it was the yellow molecules that were moving, and so I don't know what those are. Typically, yellow doesn't represent water, so I'm going to guess that would not represent osmosis directly, but osmosis is a special kind of diffusion in which H2O or water is moving. So then we also have facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is also a type of diffusion, which makes sense since it has the word diffusion in its name. And it is a type of diffusion that, again, doesn't need any energy in order for it to happen, but it does need a little help, and usually that help is in the shape of a special channel that the particle can move through. So for instance, water can move into and out of a cell without any help, without anything special. It just happens through osmosis or simple diffusion. But facilitated diffusion happens when sugar molecules like glucose are trying to move in or out of a cell, or there are a lot of other substances as well. They're too large to just naturally go through the cell membrane, so the cell membrane kind of has these special pores or channels in it that are a little bit larger that allow some other particles to be able to move through. All right, here we have an area of high concentration of those yellow particles. Again, over here is a much lower concentration. And so as we've talked about, diffusion is the movement of those molecules from area of high to low. And the whole reason is because everything in nature, in God's creation, wants to be balanced, wants to be in a state of what we call equilibrium. Equilibrium, of course, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is the word equal, and that's makes sense because things want to be equal. They want to be in balance. All right. So equilibrium, equal, have the same base, and you just have to remember that if possible, everything wants to be in balance. And so this is the reason that molecules, or the way that many molecules move in and out of cells. It doesn't take any work or effort on the part of the cell. It just happens naturally. So let's take a look at this diagram here. We've got this oval that's supposed to represent a cell. And then we've got some oxygen molecules. Some are inside the cell, some are outside the cell. The question is, how do you think that these cells, or how do you think that this oxygen is going to move? Is it going to enter the cell for the most part, or is it going to exit the cell? All right, well, have in your mind what you think is going to happen. Now let's take a look. All right, as you can see, there were some that moved in, some that moved out, but there were more that moved in than out. And the reason for that is because, to begin with, there were only 4 oxygen molecules inside the cell, and yet there were many outside the cell. So there was a much higher concentration of oxygen molecules outside the cell rather than inside the cell. Because everything wants to reach a state of equilibrium, a state of balance, the oxygen wants to do that, so to speak, keeping in mind oxygen can't actually think or have feelings, but it naturally is going to balance itself out. And so we have the molecules, for the most part, moving into the cell so that there's a much closer to equal number of oxygen molecules inside the cell as outside the cell. Here we have a lady. I'm not sure exactly what she's doing here, but we do know that she's about to inhale, and she breathes in some oxygen. So this idea of diffusion happens in our own bodies as well, and we're going to take a look at how it happens with oxygen in our bodies instead of just in an oval that represents a cell. As she breathes in, that oxygen goes into her lungs and spreads out, again, wanting to achieve equilibrium. And inside your lungs, the lungs are filled with these air sacs, these alveoli, and these air sacs fill up with this oxygen that she has breathed in. And there are also blood vessels that run nearby. So here we may have a vein or artery that runs nearby. And the blood is what carries oxygen throughout our body, but when we breathe in, the oxygen goes to our lungs, not to our blood. So how does it then get to the blood so that the red blood cells can carry the oxygen to other parts of our body? Well, it's through diffusion. So right now, there's a high concentration of oxygen molecules in the air sacs in our lungs, but there's a very low concentration in this blood vessel that is nearby. And so what happens is that the oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream. The heart then pumps and pushes the blood away from that air sac and carries the oxygen with it, and it goes out throughout your body. Here we have a blood vessel that is flowing through an area with a bunch of cells. Now, why they decided to make the cells look like bricks, I'm not entirely sure, since typically our cells as humans don't tend to look like bricks. That would be a little more representative maybe of a plant cell that has a cell wall, giving it rigidity. But for the sake of making an easy diagram, I suspect they made them look kind of brick-like. You'll notice there's an X down here in one of the cells. So we've got oxygen flowing through the blood vessel here, and we've got this cell down here, cell X, that really needs oxygen. All right, really all the cells do, but maybe this one in particular is particularly low on oxygen, but it's nowhere near an oxygen source at the moment. The oxygen is up here in the blood vessel. So how does it get to cell X? Well, it diffuses there. The high concentration of oxygen is in the blood vessel, the low concentration is in the cells. So oxygen begins to diffuse from one cell to the next cell to the next cell to the next cell. So this oxygen molecule that made its way down to the cell X probably diffused into this one, and then maybe here to here to here to here, till it finally got to the cell that had a really low concentration of oxygen where it was needed. So the same process happens in reverse in order for cells not just to get what they need, but to also get rid of what they don't need. And so in this case, our bodies need to get rid of CO2, carbon dioxide. Too much of it in our cells will eventually cause illness and then eventually death. So it's something that our bodies have to get rid of. And so right now there's a high concentration of CO2 in these cells, and they need to get rid of it. And it happens through diffusion. There's a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the cells, low concentration in the blood. So the carbon dioxide diffuses from cell to cell to cell till it gets to the blood vessel. The heart pumps and is constantly moving that blood back toward the lungs. And here it comes back to the blood vessels that are in the lungs, and then this carbon dioxide diffuses into the air sacs, and then the woman begins to exhale, and that carbon dioxide goes out of the lungs. Whoops, sorry about that. Went a little too fast. Goes out of the lungs, and she breathes that carbon dioxide out into the air. This is a process that is constantly happening in your body all the time. Now, it does take work and energy and effort to cause the muscles to move, your heart muscle and diaphragm to cause your lungs to inhale and exhale and things of that sort. But the actual diffusion part of the oxygen or carbon dioxide moving between blood vessels and air sacs and moving between blood vessels and cells and from cell to cell, that doesn't take any energy at all. It's a natural process that happens naturally. Now remember that I said that osmosis is a special type of diffusion that involves what? It involves the movement of water. So we just looked at the movement of oxygen. Now we're going to take a look at osmosis, which is just the movement of water. So we have some H2O molecules out here, some water molecules, and we have a cell. So again, osmosis is the diffusion of water from high to low concentration. So here we have some distilled pure water. Nothing else is in there. So we have a high concentration of pure water. Well, that high concentration of pure water enters this cell. All right, because inside the cell there is not a high concentration of water. I'm sure there's some water, but it's not a high concentration of water. And so we call that a hypotonic environment. Hypotonic meaning a high level of water. And then now we've added salt to that water. All right, so now we've got salt water out here outside the cell. What do you suppose is going to happen? Well, now we've got a higher concentration of pure water inside the cell than we do outside the cell. So water moves outside the cell. Whoops, one moved outside the box. Water moves outside the cell in order to try and balance it out a little bit. The salt is too big to enter the cell, too large to enter into the cell. So the water is going to do the moving, and so water exits the cell to try and balance things out and make the water outside the cell not so salty. And then facilitated diffusion is the final type of diffusion that we're looking at here, the final type of passive transport. And remember I said that there were special channels or pores in the cell membrane. These protein channels basically help things to move back and forth. So there are some things that can move through the membrane, like these bouncing blue molecules here, move through without any trouble. They can get right through the membrane. However, larger molecules need these channels to be able to get through the membrane. So here we see glucose trying to make its way into the cell. It's not able to do it by itself, but it is able to use a protein channel to get through. Again, no energy was used, just needed a larger opening. All right, we're actually going to stop right there for now, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you have a great day.